All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. It seems as though we're at a very pivotal moment in the Iran war. Donald Trump is apparently planning a major escalation in the coming days, shifting the focus of the conflict from military targets in Iran to civilian infrastructure in Iran, power plants, bridges across the country, at the encouragement of who other than Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis. This is what they discussed in their meeting last week during the week of Lindsey Graham's funeral, where Netanyahu encouraged him to increase strikes in Iran on civilian infrastructure as a way to degrade the regime even more. As we've been hearing for months, they're just days away from falling, despite no tangible signs of this being apparent. We'll discuss that today. Reports from CBS News outlining Netanyahu's push for escalation in this conflict. And then we'll also discuss the widening of this conflict across the region. There is potentially plans in the works from Saudi Arabia to escalate against the Houthis in Yemen, and in response to the Houthis threatening shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that connects the Red Sea to the Arabian Sea. So major escalations, and that could also, as well, potentially involve the United States getting involved kinetically against the Houthis in Yemen, escalating this conflict even more for the United States this is a very unraveling moment for U.S. empire in the Middle East, really showing how chaotic and reckless this decision to launch a war against Iran was. And we all knew this from the very beginning. So all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
We must take back our cities and take back our culture and take back our country.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
There is a yearning in this country for somebody who will vote for principles over party.
The people of this country want what they want, and they're not getting it. None of the wars we've went to over the past 20 years have been essential or necessary at all. They've all been wars of choice. They convince you that you are the government. They convince you that their war efforts are your war efforts. And our politicians are more focused on wars abroad than the money at home. That's the truth. The government is the problem. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you could please go down below this video here on YouTube and hit like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, Spotify, and Substack and giving all of those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. And also, go over to antiwar.com. I have a new article up from a couple of days ago titled Why Washington Won't Let Go of the Strait of Hormuz. It's a very informative piece. It's very related to what we've discussed in recent episodes of the podcast about the Strait of Hormuz and the state of affairs there. And it goes into detail about why, on the one hand, Washington won't let Tehran control the Strait of Hormuz, and why Tehran, on the other hand, would like to retain control of the Strait of Hormuz. And it kind of creates this inevitable conflict that really makes it hard to see how this war and this conflict, which now centers over the Strait of Hormuz in many ways, is going to come to a close. And just to briefly put it here, and I'd encourage everyone to go read that, the reason that Iran wants to retain control of the Strait of Hormuz is to establish deterrence against future American aggression and future American attempts and Israeli attempts to overthrow the regime in Tehran. That's the reason that Iran wants control of it, and that's the reason that America does not want Iran to retain control of it, because they want to leave the door open for a potential another round of conflict in future years with potentially future administrations. So that's kind of the thesis of the article. Go over to antiwar.com and check it out if you haven't already. And let's get into the news from today. We're not going to talk too much specifically about the Strait of Hormuz, although it'll come up. But today's episode, we're going to talk about the potentially imminent escalation in this Iran war. And we'll read the Wall Street Journal piece about this in a second here, but just for some background about why they're considering escalation in the White House in this war, there's a couple reasons for this. The main one being that nothing that they have done so far with these strikes, largely in recent weeks in the southwest portion of the country of Iran, along the coastline, the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, none of these strikes have not done anything at all to, number one, degrade the regime, number two, degrade their ability through missiles and drones to control the Strait of Hormuz and to block shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and to cut off 20% of the world's oil supply from reaching market. So these strikes have done very little to make any progress towards achieving American objectives that they set not only at the beginning of the war, but the shifting objectives, which we've seen in recent weeks, to just, at the bare minimum, open the Strait of Hormuz. It's done very little to achieve this goal. And for that reason, there is growing desperation. We saw reports a week ago that Donald Trump is literally having tantrums in the Oval Office with his advisors because he calls the Iranians scumbags and lunatics and says that they aren't acting in ways that they aren't reacting to American force in an appropriate way, basically meaning that they aren't capitulating like he wishes they would. And this has caused a lot of desperation in the White House amidst terrible poll numbers on this war, amidst the potentially imminent economic catastrophe that has resulted from this global oil supply squeeze that we've seen in recent months from the Strait of Hormuz's closure. All of these different factors have kind of culminated in this real desperation from Washington to get this war done with, because it's been such an utter disaster. Nothing that they sought to achieve has been achieved. None of these strikes that they've been trying to do in recent weeks have done anything. Nothing is giving. And for this reason, we are now considering escalation. Instead of trying to de-escalate and take our lumps and move on with our lives and try and focus on anything important, they are determined to end this war on their terms, get some sort of a win, something that they can spin at the very least into a win, like Iran agreeing to open the Strait of Hormuz. They can frame that as the United States liberates the strait, something they can frame into a win. But this is part of the Iranian doctrine at this point as well. They are doing everything they can to dig their heels in Iran. They don't want the United States to be able to frame anything into a win, because they want this, specifically at this point, to become as painful as possible for the United States to deter them ever trying this again in the future. So on the one hand, you have Iran, who is being incredibly, they're very determined to establish this deterrence for the future. And then you have the United States, desperate here, flailing with no military objectives having been achieved, trying to spin something into a win here and being totally unable to do so. And for that reason, and for reasons of ego, for petty reasons from Donald Trump personally, he's unwilling to just accept this and move on, admit it was a loss, which it obviously has been, and do what's best for himself politically and the country, and move on with this and stop digging yourself deeper into this hole. But he has instead decided that we must come out of this in the end with a military victory, something he can put as a military victory. And for that reason, we're considering escalation. And in an effort, again, which is totally irrational and makes no sense, to overthrow the regime, which by all accounts is not on the verge of collapse, despite the propaganda in the Western media. This regime has been, and this is a misunderstanding that got us into this war in the first place from Donald Trump, who bought the Israeli narrative that they were selling him back in February, that this regime was on the verge of collapse. Those protests in early January against the regime were a sign of a real underground network in Iran of pro-liberty, pro-democracy groups and factions and organized resistance in the country against the Ayatollah and the IRGC. They were able to convince Donald Trump, according to some reporting that's come out since, that if the United States would just go in there and bomb some police stations, bomb some regime targets, kill the top brass of the leadership, the Ayatollah and his clique, then a massive vacuum would open up where then these kind of silent resistance movements in the country that we're told exist, that believe in democracy and American ideals, would swoop in, fill the ranks of the institutions that have been emptied out, and institute democracy on the country, and that everyone in the country would unite around this shared vision of Western liberalism or something. This is what we were genuinely told, despite how ridiculous that is of a notion that this was going to happen. There's no evidence to back this up. There never was. And despite the history of Washington using this as the fundamental pretext for Middle East intervention in the past, spreading democracy, spreading liberty, the virtues of the American ideals, despite this being the pretext used falsely in the past and having been exposed as a false pretext, despite all of this, they still went with this as the excuse, and despite all this, Trump still bought it. According to lots of reporting, this is what Netanyahu told him in the weeks leading up to the war in February would happen. And people, I just from watching people who are in the know, who know the vice president's team, who know the president, people around the White House, Trump genuinely seemed to believe this. He genuinely believed that this would be over in 4 days, as the original estimate said, that this war would take 3 to 4 days of strikes, and then somehow in 3 to 4 days, the regime was so flimsy that it would just collapse. This just simply did not happen. There was never this organized group of dissidents in the country that then rose up and took advantage of the chaos and instability, the amount that existed after the Americans and Israelis struck Iran, and was able to rally the masses to take the country back from the Ayatollah. This just never happened. And we've seen evidence of the contrary. We saw what looked like millions of people go to the Ayatollah's funeral just a couple weeks ago in Tehran. So this never happened. The notion that we were fed before the war that the regime was incredibly flimsy has been proven totally false. It turns out they were much more entrenched than we even realized in many ways. And it's become apparent now, people knew this before, but it's become much more apparent that they were preparing for this for decades, this exact scenario where America was coming in to enact regime change. They have underground cities of factories and military outposts. They have underground systems on a massive scale, preparing for this exact moment. And it represents just an entrenchment of the regime that was mischaracterized by the United States. It was totally false, the notion that they were about to collapse and that they were incredibly flimsy institutionally in the country. And yet, despite the evidence pointing to this conclusion that maybe it is the case that the regime is entrenched and that we weren't going to overthrow them with a couple airstrikes, despite the evidence pointing to that conclusion, we still have people advocating for an escalation to overthrow the regime. And this brings us to today, where we're being told that by the administration that if only we strike a little bit harder and strike the civilian infrastructure and really make it felt in a major way in the society as a whole in the country, then the regime is going to fall. This is what we're being told. Here's the Wall Street Journal discussing these potentially imminent strikes, this imminent escalation by the United States and Israel against Iran. It says, quote, President Trump has ordered the military to launch a fresh attack on Iran that could begin as soon as this weekend and last a few days, U.S. officials said. Earlier Friday, he told reporters that he planned to resume heavy military strikes to force the regime to come to the negotiating table. He predicted that if the U.S. hit Iran hard enough, the hardline regime would eventually peter out. We will be hitting them very hard, Trump said Friday at a televised cabinet meeting at Camp David. And at some point they're going to say, quote, we just can't take it anymore. Trump authorized the new attack plan presented to him at the presidential retreat, U.S. officials said. But they noted any immediate progress on the diplomatic front could convince Trump to halt the planned strikes and return to negotiations. He also could simply change his mind. Quote, as President Trump said at his cabinet meeting today, the United States will win and Iran will not have a nuclear weapon under his watch, said White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. This is the sort of mindless just slop that's being fed to the media, obviously just giving us no glimpse at what's going on. But that is an important caveat there at the very end, that Trump could just change his mind and basing that rationale on a diplomatic breakthrough. This is something that we've seen play out repeatedly. We've seen repeatedly when Trump makes these massive threats over the course of this war to destroy civilization and have Bridge and Power Plant Day, that he justifies canceling that and calling it off. He justifies it using these notions that Iran is coming to the table begging for a deal. They want a deal more than you even know. This has been the repeated justification for halting the strikes and for pulling back on the more large-scale threats made by Trump. And none of it's been true. We've heard in recent weeks, as we are very clearly moving in a direction of escalation in this conflict, as the war is widening in many ways, as the economic calamity that seems to be coming is quickly approaching, as the polls are plummeting, as Trump is losing political capital at quite a fast rate, as all this is happening, as this is getting worse and worse for the administration, we're still hearing simultaneously that an escalation is necessary, that we must up our efforts on the bombing front, we must escalate to striking civilian infrastructure, and that we must move forward until we finish the job. It's all this kind of garbage talking points from Mark Thiessen on Fox News. This like football lingo, we've stopped at the 20-yard line, we need to kick it into the end zone. This is what we're hearing on one side, that we have not finished the job and we need to. But also, Iran is begging for a deal, and that they want a deal more than you know, and that we could make a deal right now, but we're choosing not to. That's what you're hearing on that end. So on one side, you have, we must escalate. Trump saying in meetings at the White House that they're lunatics, they're scumbags. Why aren't they caving to a deal? But then in the public, you hear they want a deal really bad. They're begging us for a deal. They're begging us behind the scenes to make a deal to end the war. You can't have it both ways, and you can't be an honest observer of this conflict and not admit that somewhere along the line they are lying to you. They're not telling the public the truth about the war, as they haven't been this entire time. Now, it's important to note here that the Israelis themselves, at least in recent weeks, have not been directly involved in these strikes on Iran. But if we were to escalate, if this potentially imminent plan was to be carried out in coming days, the Israelis would very likely jump back into the fray. And even though they have not been directly militarily involved in recent weeks, Netanyahu has been a very consistent and influential voice in Trump's ear pushing for escalation. We'll get into this here in a second in the report from CBS News, that Netanyahu is the one behind the scenes who has been pushing for weeks for Trump to escalate the strikes in Iran, striking civilian infrastructure, the power plants, and the bridges in the country, following what we know to be the Israeli doctrine of military activity, which is having really no willingness to differentiate between civilian targets and military targets. We've seen that play out in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran. We've seen that play out all across the region, that Israel shows no regard for human life or civilian life at all in their military conduct. And he is encouraging Trump to continue with that strategy as well, and to change the strategy in Iran from targeting military targets along the coast, these missile launch platforms, and their stockpiles, the visible ones that we can see, many of them we cannot see, of drones and missiles, the infrastructure allowing them to control the Strait, because again, that is the center of this conflict in many ways at this point, is the control of the Strait of Hormuz. That's what they've been doing thus far, and it's had literally zero effect on the dynamic of the war in the Strait or of the regime's ability to control the country. There's been no benefit to the United States from continuing these strikes. They've done nothing. Nothing is giving. Trump is getting frustrated, verbally in the White House, very obviously getting frustrated with the Iranians. And so then swoops in Netanyahu to tell him the way to get out of this, which is, according to him, escalate the war, which of course would be completely counterproductive because that would get us deeper entrenched in this stupid conflict that does not benefit us. But Netanyahu is coming in and telling him the way to make something give here, to shake things up, to change the dynamic, would be to escalate and strike civilian infrastructure, and that would create the energy in the country, according to Netanyahu, to really shake up the regime and make them collapse. Now, Trump seems completely unable to adapt to the reality of the situation, which is that Netanyahu was lying then, back in February, when he made this case to Trump. It did not play out like Netanyahu said, and now Trump, despite this horrendous track record of Netanyahu's predictions in Trump's ear, which Netanyahu knew wasn't going to happen, but he wanted to get Trump involved in the war. Despite this track record from Netanyahu showing he's wrong every step of the way, and has been wrong for, keep in mind, 30 years about the Middle East and what would happen if the United States got deeper involved in the conflicts in the Middle East. But now Trump is going to listen to Netanyahu again and take his advice to escalate, and somehow thinks that this will finally, after all this time, cause the regime to collapse, despite there being no evidence for this, despite our own CIA this entire time having told Trump that it's not going to happen, the regime is not going to collapse from airstrikes alone like this, and it's not helping us. So he's ignoring our own intelligence agencies, which are behind the scenes telling him this is not the correct assessment, this is a misreading of the situation, and he's prioritizing and favoring the assessments given him by the Israelis, by Netanyahu and the Mossad. So we're literally, the decisions being made are being influenced much more by the Israelis than our own CIA. So that tells you the state of affairs in this administration, for who they're favoring for military assessments and military advice given to Trump. And this is CBS News discussing that. It says, quote, when Mr. Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met earlier this week, Netanyahu briefed him on 3 options for the war, including military strikes on land resupply routes, a senior Israeli official said. Netanyahu also met with Defense Secretary Hegseth. The U.S. has already struck bridges in this conflict that were dual use, used by military and civilians, a U.S. official said. So Netanyahu is at the White House encouraging him to escalate and strike these civilian targets. And this, I just want to show this clip here in a second. This is just not realistic. This isn't going to work. And to the extent that it, quote unquote, works, it will only serve as a destabilizing force. It's obviously just blatantly immoral to strike civilian targets, obviously. And it is just militarily not going to have a effect that they think it will. And here is, to explain that in much better detail, here's just a clip from today. This is Brandon Weichert, who's an actual expert on all of this on Mario Nafal's show on YouTube. Here is him explaining why strikes on civilian infrastructure just is a misreading of the situation. To do this and think it's going to be beneficial is a misreading of the situation. Take a look.
Do you think, what would you give it the odds that power plants and energy infrastructure are going to be struck at scale, not like 1 or 2 or 3 here or there?
You're saying by the American-Israeli side? Yeah, I think it's a fait accompli at this point. Probably 80% chance at this point. Because think about it.
Wow.
Just think about it. I hope I'm wrong, by the way, but just think about it. If the president really is President Trump, if he's really thinking, I've got to go big one last time to send a message to Tehran, they better get to the table and they better start taking me seriously at the table and do what I want them to do. Well, the military-only strikes aren't working. I mean, that is one thing Conricus in our debate a few weeks ago was right about. The Americans keep hitting military targets. I mean, I don't think we should attack civilian targets. But if you're in that mentality, you're saying, I've already been doing all these military targets only. It's not having an effect. I need to expand the scale now to get them to do what I want. The only way he's going to do that is if he targets that infrastructure. Now, if he does this, that's it. It's not going to bring them to the table. I can't stress this enough. He's completely misreading it. We're not dealing with Caracas. We're not dealing with a Maduro regime. This is not a materialist regime. Okay, the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic in the eyes of its people and the eyes of the rest of the world lies in its religiosity as well as its perception of resistance to the American juggernaut. So they're not going to be cowed by I mean, look, we took on the Taliban. They didn't have any of technology, accoutrements, and they defeated us. Okay, they got a strategic victory over us. They wore us down. It's the same thing the Iranians are going to do to us.
Again, one of the key lies that got us into this war is that there is this organized, militarized faction of Iran that is ready and waiting for the United States to swoop in with airstrikes on regime targets and on civilian targets, that is ready and waiting to take control of the government from the IRGC if only the United States and Israel would step in to help. That was a fundamental notion that carried us into this war, that Trump somehow believed. And that is a fundamental notion that's carrying us into this escalation. They genuinely think that striking civilian infrastructure will inspire the people of the country to join the side of the people bombing civilian infrastructure. That's what they think is going to happen. What we've seen is totally the opposite. Back a couple months ago, when Trump originally threatened to bomb the bridges and power plants, what did we see in Iran? We saw civilians literally encircling, creating human chains around the power plants holding Iranian flags, saying, come and bomb us. That was what they were doing in Iran. We saw at the Ayatollah's funeral a couple weeks ago what looked like millions of people gather to mourn the Ayatollah. And we're chanting death to America. It seems to have inspired a rallying around the flag effect in Iran for their government and a large amount of hatred for the United States, which has bombed civilian infrastructure already at this point in Iran, which in the early days of the conflict struck a school in Iran, killing over 100 girls in Iran. I don't think bombing civilian infrastructure, this is a wild guess, I don't think bombing civilian infrastructure will inspire the civilians to rally to your cause. I think the much more likely outcome is that hatred for the United States grows in Iran after they attack civilian infrastructure, and the people of Iran in large numbers rally around the government. That's, I think, the most likely outcome. I don't think it's Netanyahu's fanciful ideas of the people are going to see the attacks on their civilian infrastructure and on bridges and power plants and have their energy wiped out across the country, and then they're going to join the side of the people doing that to them. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's totally unrealistic, and it's totally just, it's not going to happen. That is the latest with this war in Iran, in terms of the United States and Iran directly. That's the potential we may see in the coming days, the escalation that was described there, the United States striking alongside Israel civilian infrastructure in Iran. And we're going to end off today by just quickly discussing the Saudi escalation against Ansar Allah in Yemen. This has been in the works for a couple days, it seems, and this just got reported the other day in The Guardian that Saudi Arabia is preparing a sea and possibly land offensive against the Houthis, also known as Ansar Allah in Yemen, in response to the Houthis threatening shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and threatening Saudi shipping specifically. And this is just the story from The Guardian. It says, quote, Saudi Arabia is preparing for a major military offensive against the Houthis by sea and possibly by land in central Yemen, Yemeni sources believe, in a move to break the chokehold on its oil exports through the southern Red Sea. Saudi forces have been seen withdrawing from the east of Yemen in what could be preparation for a land offensive. At the same time, Riyadh is trying to organize a naval coalition to protect shipping from Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Saudi Defense Ministry said on Thursday that 14 states, including Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, Sudan, and Djibouti, have issued a joint statement supporting a multinational marine defense coalition. Now, and also down below here, it says Riyadh has also asked the U.S. and a group of European countries, including Germany, France, and the U.K. and Italy, to join a Red Sea coalition. So now, as this war has expanded, we talked about this last episode, the Houthis have now gotten involved on behalf of the Iranians and used their missiles and their drones to strike a number of ships in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and threaten to strike Saudi ships in the strait as well. And they have, in many ways, effectively closed off the strait, or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And this was the route that Saudi was shipping a portion of their oil through. Once the Strait of Hormuz was closed, they shipped it across the country from the east to the west using the east-west pipeline to the Red Sea to export it through the south, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and out into the Arabian Sea. This was being used by the Saudis, and was part of the reason why the oil markets didn't completely, or why the price of oil didn't completely skyrocket in the ways that some predicted, because the Saudis were kind of ready for this and adjusted to this kind of on the fly. And now with this closure, that really threatens the Saudis' ability to ship and export oil, and this causes a real problem for them. So as a result, they're gathering this coalition of 14 countries to potentially join in on an offensive against the Houthis. And there are some reasons to believe why this could potentially be a sign of a prolonged conflict coming up. This is because the Saudis have had a war against the Houthis already in Yemen. They did so from 2015 to about 2023, and it had no effect at all. The Houthis still control Sana'a, which is the capital. They control a lot of land along the Red Sea, and they've maintained this ability over the course of the last few years to disrupt shipping whenever they feel like it. That's the reason behind the attacks against the Houthis from the United States last year in 2025 and early in the Trump term. Biden attacked the Houthis as well. This has been a long-term thing, and there's no reason to believe that now the Saudis' new campaign against the Houthis is going to have any greater effect in deteriorating their strongholds or their grasp on a significant portion of the country of Yemen. And this now, Trump has himself said that the United States may restart operations against the Houthis in Yemen, which we saw last year and that may again happen this year. And just that alone, that now Trump had a war against the Houthis, a short-term, couple-week campaign back in February and March of last year, and now we're returning to it, admitting that it was totally ineffective last time, and they maintained their ability to disrupt shipping, which was what we claimed to be trying to deteriorate. And Biden also launched a war against them. So Biden struck the Houthis, Trump struck the Houthis, now Trump might be striking the Houthis again. The Saudis had a 7-year campaign against them and now is restarting it. So when are we going to acknowledge here that it's very difficult to deteriorate the Houthis, and this represents a widening of the conflict, this greater conflict in the Middle East? The Iran war is expanding now to another front, and this war is out of control. When are we allowed to acknowledge that this is all out of control? This is all ridiculous. It was all totally unnecessary. It has no good solution, and we should cut our losses and leave. Why are we allowing this to spiral out of control here? It's really shocking that there's no interest in de-escalating. It reminds you of it can't help but remind me of when Biden was in office as Russia invaded Ukraine. And there's just no interest in de-escalating or negotiating to end this war that could very easily spiral out of control. It's much like that. This war, in many ways, could spiral out of control militarily, economically, strategically. Yet there is no willingness, seemingly, to engage in serious talks. We are so trapped up in this ego game that we are so determined to end this war on our terms with a military victory. And that doesn't even take into account the cost. We have no regard for the cost of that, which would be the global economy being in chaos, the American economy being in chaos. All for what exactly? To win the war that was launched based off lies and cause instability across the region now, in Yemen again, in Saudi, in the Red Sea. This is all just, all of this represents a totally unnecessary conflict that never needed to happen, and we could end it. We could just walk away. But again, the egos are too big in this situation to admit defeat or even walk away without admitting defeat. You don't have to say you lost the war. Just walk away. Trump could, if he wants to, just end the war and move on to a different subject. That would still be, right now, the best solution to this. Yet, we're so determined to frame this as a win and, I guess, overthrow the regime that we're going to go to the end of the earth to do so, regardless of the costs, militarily and to stability in the region. So that's the latest on this conflict, this expanding, widening conflict in the region. And that's where we'll end it off for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to go down below this video and hit like and subscribe here on YouTube. And also go to my Instagram, X, Spotify, and Substack. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
We must take back our cities and take back our culture and take back our country.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.